And I picked up David Blight's biography of Frederick Douglass. And I knew a little bit about Frederick Douglass, but I did not know that I could sit on my deck and see the street where he lived. As I read the book, it just hit me, that this would be a great project to take the words of Frederick Douglass and illustrate them. Where he lived here 200 years ago, there's no photographic record. This county is changing rapidly. And before the last vestiges of Frederick Douglass are gone, try to get some sense of what this county looked like 200 years ago. Lived 6 years along the Tuckahoe in a very, very poor farm, and then moved to White House, which at that point was the center of wealth, the center of power, political power, economic power in the mid-Atlantic. So he goes from this little tiny isolated place on the Tuckahoe to White House for 2 years, then Baltimore, which then was the third largest city in the U.S., primarily a free African-American population at that point, much more relaxed, but then has to come back here for another 2.5 years, then back to Baltimore. So he has all these fascinating experiences, and all those experiences came together to produce probably the greatest slave narrative in American literature. So Frederick Douglass wrote 3 autobiographies, and he detailed his Talbot experience. And so what I did is I selected passages from those 3 autobiographies so that someone can get a fairly full understanding of his Talbot experience by reading those passages. And then now I've got the imagery attached to it. And I think probably his most eloquent passage in his biographies is when he is describing his year at the Covey farm over near Whitman. He's on the shores of Chesapeake Bay. Covey is a Negro breaker and a slave breaker. And Covey would break them. And they sent Frederick Douglass, to be broken to the farm. And he is standing on the shore of the Chesapeake, watching these beautiful sailing ships going by with their white robe sails, as he said. And he wrote this lament: "I am fast in my chains, and am a slave. The glad ship is gone, she hides in the dim distance. I am left in the hell of unending slavery. It cannot be that I shall live and die a slave. I will take to the water. This very bay shall yet bear me into freedom." In those days, when enslaved people were buried, there was no marker. And it was a stone, perhaps, but more often no mark at all. And he hardly ever saw his mother because his mother had been leased out to someone else. So he was raised by his grandmother, and he writes this passage: "My mother died when I could not have been more than 8 or 9 years old. Her grave is as the grave of the dead at sea, unmarked and without a stone or stake." He returns, many years later, well after the Civil War, and his return is triumphant. His return to Talbot County is triumphant. And there's one passage that I think perfectly describes it. He says, and he's looking at the White House, and he says, "I left there as a slave and returned as a free man. I left on a vessel belonging to Colonel Edward Lloyd and returned on one belonging to the United States." He returned on a revenue cutter. That is the flag flown by revenue cutters in the 1880s. So to understand Frederick Douglass and understand who he was, you have to have a sense of the place where he was from. And one of the characteristics is the water. And Douglass never lived more than a few steps away from the water, for most of his youth. And he always saw that water as his highway to freedom.